on their phone, you can request them to please head out and finish the conversation. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please hold on to your questions. The moderator will point out who can ask the question, and we'll have the mic sent over. I would also request you to please share the photos and the videos on our various social media platforms with the hashtag ZJLF. I would now like to announce our esteemed panel for today's discussion. Being the other, we have Saeed Naqvi, Qaisra Shahraz, Sadia Dehlvi, and Tabish Khair in conversation with Ornit Shani.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. It's a great pleasure to have with us today Sadia Dehlvi, Qaisra Shahraz, Tabish Khair, and Saeed Naqvi with us. Reading your books over the last fortnight has been a truly enriching experience for me, both intellectually and emotionally. And what we're going to do, I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of the books, so you'll know what these wonderful books are about, and then draw a common theme to have a discussion from. So Saeed's Being the Other, we don't have the book with us, but the book Being the Other is a gripping eyewitness account of a thread of seminal events in contemporary Indian history that have been detrimental to Muslims in India and consequential to their othering. In tracing this process from independence, Saeed takes us through chapters like the 1981 Meenakshipuram conversions of Dalits to Christianity, a series of communal riots, the Sangh Parivar's Rath Yatra of 1989, 1990, the destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in 1992, the Gujarat 2002 violence, onto the effects of the global war on terror, on the dynamics of the othering of Muslims. In India, the systematic othering of Muslims was driven from the 1980s by growing belligerent Hindu extremism. Saeed's reflection on his experience of these events, both as a journalist who covered them and as a Muslim, throws lights on the affective dimensions of the process of becoming the other, which academic studies and journalistic explanations rarely provide. Indeed, his account is also a sad lament for the vanished syncretic Hindu-Muslim culture and its expression in everyday practices of life, whereby the distinctions between people of these faiths were far more blurred than they are today. Tabish's Jihadi Jain, and we have the book here, so Tabish's Jihadi Jain is a powerful novel conveyed as a first-hand insider's account of two British girls of South Asian origins, Jamila, who's the narrator, and Amina. These young women leave England a year after finishing high school to join Daesh, or as it's known, ISIS or IS, in Syria. Jamila was brought up as an observant Muslim. Amina was like many of those who joined Daesh, secular. They were radicalized, with Amina joining to become a jihadi bride. Tabish deals with the perplexing phenomena of young, educated girls from Europe, leaving everything behind to join and support Daesh. Jamila reflects at length on what led her and Amina to join Daesh. Qaisra's The Holy Woman, and we do have the book here, draws us into a tragic love story set in the main in Pakistan in the 1990s. At the center of the elaborated plot is Zari Bano, an exceptionally talented, beautiful, intelligent, and free-spirited daughter of a zamindar. She successfully pursued her university education in Karachi, immersed herself in liberal feminist thinking, and campaigned for women's rights. She then refused many suitors and was driven by an aspiration to start a publishing house in Karachi. Ultimately, when the right suitor, Sikandar, arrives and they fall in love at first sight and Zaribano wishes strongly to marry him, she finds her identity stripped of her. Under the dictates of entrenched institutional patriarchy of her father, because her brother, the only heir, dies in an accident, she is forced to marry the Quran instead, to become a holy woman or a Shahzadi Ibtat. In effect, she becomes the heiress of the clan, married to the family land, but can never marry. Zari Bano's life would conducted from that moment onwards from beneath the veil of the black burqa. Finally, Sadia's Sufism, the heart of Islam, takes the reader on a spiriting, overwhelming historical journey into Sufism. It is an aesthetic journey for the reader, not just because of the moving Sufi poetry of both female and male Sufis that is weaved throughout the book, but also for the beautiful calligraphies and artistic representations that fill its pages. It is also Sadia's personal journey and life commitment. In taking us on this expedition, Sadia wishes to undo myth and propaganda about Islam in the face of Islamic radicalization. Unlike the crude and rigid Islam and the concept of jihad of Daesh that has become the currency of the day in political and public discourses, an Islam that is uprooted of its social, cultural, community lived experiences, human ideas, moderation and reflection, like the one that Jamila and Amila from Tabish's Jihadi Jane finds in Syria. It's what Sadia shows us quite meticulously is, and as Sufi masters have done before, is that religion or Islam has no meaning unless worn by emotions of love and human ideals, and that Sufism in its poetry, dance, and music appeals to universal love and is inseparable from Islam. Particularly since 9/11, Islam increasingly seemed to have been captured by the discourse of anger and rhetoric of rage, which has also become a basis for or a driving force in the othering of Muslims. Sadia attempts to restore Islam back to its true place and face. In that sense, her book speaks from a religious and textual perspective to Saeed's lament on the loss in India of a composite culture. So, all authors, in different ways, deal with the growing religious extremism that we have seen now for a while and which has played a role in the process of othering of many Muslim groups and communities into a single whole. But all of you, and that's what I found most interesting, one of the most interesting in the books, all of you, again, in different ways, explore this process as one that is not simply the result of religious antagonism and radicalization. And this is the theme I would like to explore with you. To what extent is religion really the driver? And if religion is not the primary driver, why then has it become so effective in mobilizing people politically? And I would like to start with you, Saeed. You suggest that in India there is a connection between the othering, you suggest that in India there is a connection between the othering of Muslims as the threatening other, quote unquote, to changes that occurred in relation to caste and class. And what I would like you to do for us is to elaborate on these connections. Why has religion become such a powerful category for political mobilization, especially in the face of the many other minorities in India? So please, Tiz.
History. Thank you very much, Ornit, Shani. I have just discovered, in fact, I was suspecting that Ornit was a Hebrew name, and I thought I might as well stress the fact, since you're talking about connections and how various categories of people interact with each other, that after my first visit to Israel, and I wrote a paper. Rajiv Gandhi in those days was in two minds. He said that to upgrade relations with Israel, the Muslim vote bank of his would dissolve. I said, Rajiv, you do not have to be more loyal than the king. I said, do you know that King Hussein of Jordan has relations with Israel? Do you know that under the table, even Riyadh has relations with Israel? Do you know that every year in Morocco, in Rabat, King Hassan, who was alive then, has an annual jamboree of the Jewish, Sephardic Jewish people. So therefore, for heaven's sake, you are completely mistaken. Indian Muslims, this is a fake construct that Indian Muslims will walk away, that the important issues for them are Salman Rushdie's book, that the important issues for them are the Muslim character of Aligarh University, that the important issue is relations with Israel. This is complete nonsense. Muslims need entrepreneurial help. Muslims need education. Muslims need support from you. And you know, he could listen at some moments, and he asked me to write a document. And I wrote a paper asking him why relations with Israel should be upgraded. And when they were, the state of Israel has given me, and if you come to my house, you will see two contrasting pictures on my wall. On the one side is a picture of this little document I have from the government. 10 trees in the name of Saeed Naqvi have been planted in the hills of Jerusalem for the role that he played in promoting India's relationships with Israel. Alongside is another photograph of me sitting in the tent with my old friend Muammar Gaddafi. Now sort me out if you can.
But now take us back to India and tell us, so that's something that I found really compelling, as I said, that, you know, although it appears to be religion and religious extremism that drives the othering of Muslims, you do indicate connections to other things like caste and class, and I would like you to elaborate.
You see, there are two things.
We don't hear that enough. So
Ornit, there are two things. One is the entire syncretic experience of India is a social cultural experience. In other words, if you say, talking of my area, which is Awadh, it is a triangular thing. The Sufi shrine, the rural countryside, and the Haveli, which was the landlord. There was a rural-urban continuum which resulted in this. Let me give you just one example. And I will explain it to you. Sughar panhari bharle pani. Now, Sughar panhari, this is a very folksy, dehati language. In my part of the world, Sughar means efficient. Panihari is the woman who fills the water pitcher. Sughar panihari, bharle pani, abahu savera, kuan hai akela. It is dusk. The well is lonely. Phir na aayi hai bharan tori bari. Then you will not get a chance to fill your pitcher. Now, you will think it is only talking about filling the water from that image is being used in a Sufi song, which means Shah Mahdi Gagariya Utaro Naeem ki. Shah Mahdi is the saint whose shrine is being talked about. Gagariya, the pitcher. Utaro Naeem is the singer, is the poet. Shah Mahdi Gagariya Utaro Naeem ki. Tum na utari ho, to kou na utari, bharle pani. You see the continuum between the rural countryside, the Sufi shrine, and the Haveli. That is what it was, a social, cultural experience. It was disrupted and ruptured by politics. And the politics of 1947, the partition, it created conditions for rupturing it. And how? Remember that two things happened at the same time. India became an electoral democracy In 1947, India became a partitioned country in 1947. What happened? A country was created on the other side, which this side proceeded to hate. And they proceeded to hate us. And this subcontinent riven by hate, given electoral politics, just imagine what one category, how it would affect the other. And that is what has happened. What we see today is a consequence of that decision. And therefore, it is everybody who was involved in 1947 is extremely guilty. And the guilt for what is going on in the country today must be laid at the door of everybody. And if you want me to spell out who they are, maybe later.
Okay, so I mean, you take us historically into 1947, and you say we have to go back there and go with the thread to understand the complexities of that. And, you know, if I'm bringing us to the present, and the present going beyond India, right, what we are experiencing worldwide, I want to take it to you, Tabish, and to move on to your two girls who chose just a year after they finish high school to join Daesh. So the joining of young women and men to Daesh has been something that I personally found very difficult to account for. It seems incomprehensible. And yet I admit that there was a moment, when I read your book, there was a moment in the book that I could identify with Jamila and understand why she saw this as a meaningful option. And I would like you to try and elaborate and reflect for us on the complex processes in the West that drive that kind of othering and alienation that result in finding religious explanations and solutions so appealing. So please.
Thank you. I have been concerned with this issue of the other, and if we had more time, I would distinguish between othering and the other, the political notion of othering and the philosophical construct of the other, but we'll leave that out. And of course, Jihadi Jain is a novelized intervention. Just before that, I'd published a study called The New Xenophobia by Oxford, which is a theorized intervention in that matter. The other is in some ways, as a political construct, the other is always being constructed in societies, in all societies, okay? Which is very different from the other as a philosophical concept, because the other is in philosophy is just another self. And in that sense, we all construct others, whether it's a minority person or a majority person, whether it's a European or an Indian, whether it's a Muslim or Hindu, that hardly matters. We construct others. And in the West, obviously, there are certain kinds of construction of otherness in place. Islam has historically been one of them for various reasons. The way European history has been interpreted as a very, very wide space, the various multicultural elements that have been evaded, even the fact that the very year, from the very dock, from where Columbus set out to discover the New World, the last batches of Jews were banished. Same year, same dock. We don't remember that. We remember Columbus setting out to discover the New World. So these are all parts of history that have remained in place. The other problem is, of course, the fact that the West, which is again a construct and can be a constructor for otherness coming from me, the West, for the sake of convenience, I'll use the term, the West has been dominant for centuries, and dominance tends to make you believe that you are the only person who has contributed. And the West has that hubris. All of science, all of literature, it all seems to come back to the West. Not among scholars, not among people like you, ordinary media discourse. So when these girls and boys grow up in places like that, they are faced with a kind of impoverishment of their cultural inheritance, as well as a kind of alienation. Into that mix comes a very simple version of Islamic fundamentalism. which is again reinforced by the way Muslims are seen in the West. They're not seen as coming from a cultural complex like Naqvi Sahab highlighted, the Sufi tradition, for instance. They're seen as people who believe in one book. And the Islamists come up with this one book, which no Muslim can deny, obviously, and the West also says that this is what defines Islam, and they come up with, what is more interesting, a single reading of that one book. Okay? That's the complex that actually creates some of these problems.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to add myself that, it was surprising to me in the novel that, the realization that, in fact, the process of radicalization through watching these YouTubes and persons they get in touch with, the discussions are not simply about Islam. It's about the mundane things of life, the woman that recruits them. In fact, she's like a sister, like a mother, and, that's another side that is extremely fascinating. Qaisra, you're Zaribano, so Jamila and Amina, and we go to another, there's a strong gender dimension in your two books, which is fascinating in itself. And your Zaribano succumbed without struggle to her father's wish that she becomes a bride of the Quran. And her upbringing had not been particularly religious. This practice of marrying the Quran, as I understood, is also, as her university professor tells her, it's even un-Islamic. But even more frustrating, particularly for me as a reader who's a woman, is that here is Zaribano, a woman of exceptional agency, who fought in college for women's rights, succumbed without struggle, like that. So I want to ask you, where has all her agency gone? What happened to her agency? Is that here, please?
Thank you, Ornit. I think before I talk about Zaribano, I'll give context to the book. This theme of being the other is very, very relevant for me. I think born in Pakistan, growing up in England, the multiple identities has been a very enriching experience for me. And as a writer, I have used it throughout my writing life. So living in England, my literature that I studied at university, at school, was all European, English, British, etc. I loved books. And for many years, I wrote many stories focusing on cultural issues. When it came to the novel, I almost wanted to say, I want to write a novel for myself, for a group of people, Pakistanis who live in Britain, with their own personal experience. And at that time, it was written 20 years ago, there weren't many books or literature, novels coming out of Pakistan, for example. And it was almost like writing a book for myself where I explore what it's like for Muslims in Britain to have a heritage in another country. And I wanted to share that world for my non-Muslim readers, particularly the English friends I had. So it was like writing a book for other people to explain, to show my own world that I knew as a Muslim, as a Pakistani. But the idea for the Holy Woman, I'll show you, this is the one we have here at the festival. This is the UK version at the moment, and this is the Urdu version published by Penguin called Zaribano. It came from one night, I was watching a documentary by Channel 4, where they showed how in a small part of Pakistan, in Sindh, to keep the land, the inheritance in the family, they actually married the women to the Quran. And I was shocked. What nonsense was this? I knew nothing about it. In Islam, we normally get married, have children. And as a feminist, always fighting for women's rights, it was shocking for me. And I took the idea that very night, and I wanted to explore it, to raise awareness about this issue. But I also knew it's only followed, or has been, by a very small minority. It is not a widespread custom, and it's definitely against the Muslim tradition. And throughout my novel, I take care in debunking this idea of this myth in my novel. Now, the challenge for me as an author was that the heroine I've created, that Ornit has just mentioned, she's a modern 20th century, well-educated woman, a publisher, and yet I wanted to make her a holy woman. How can I bring this about? So I came up with an idea that the other theme I wanted to explore in this book was patriarchal tyranny and matriarchal tyranny. In my novel, I have a father who forces his daughter Zaribana to actually marry the Quran and become a holy woman. And then I have a mother, Judrani Kaniz, in a village who does the same with her son. So the challenge for me as an author was, how would this wash with my readers? Say, how can a modern woman become a holy woman? So I came up with the idea of irrational jealousy, that the father actually forces his daughter to actually become a holy woman by saying, you want a man in your life. And for a Muslim father to say that to a daughter is quite something. So I use the sexual tones to bring that about. So I can talk more, but I'll give other people a chance. Okay?
If, Ornit, just Qaisra, after what I've heard, a question, it may be a little out of your theme, but it occurs to me because you are located, you live in Manchester, and that is where you're trying to communicate to the others.
Absolutely.
I have never for the life of me understood why in England, repeatedly, the phrase that comes up is Paki bashing and not indie bashing. Have you thought about that? Why is Pakistani the hated image and not the Indian? Huh?
It's a minority, right? It's a minority issue. So, you know, both Saeed and Tabish mentioned in their responses the problem of, you know, you really explained beautifully and with a little story you gave about what Islam really meant in social life. And as you said, you know, they see a single Islam that is so divorced of reality, and you were speaking of something that is basically, as you say, un-Islamic. You were outraged to see that. And Sadia, you know, you show us in your book, the Sufism, the heart of Islam, you show us very persuasively that the real Islam has been taken over, that many of the expressions of Islam nowadays are deviations of both the Prophet's true, what you call true preaching, and from the historical practices of Islam in daily life. So can you tell us more about how and why this has happened, right? I mean, with all these thick traditions.
Well, like you said, thank you for appreciation of my work. It's really been focused on highlighting inclusive narratives of Islam. One of the modern day problems, like you said, is the delinking of Islam with the Sufi tradition. It has really led to disastrous consequences. I think for the last 1400 years, nobody's challenged, except in the last 100 years, that Sufism is really not an Islamic tradition. It is the heart of Islam. It's the spiritual current that flows within Islam. It represents the dynamism of Islam to adapt to local cultures. In India, Islam is very organic. There was no thought that we converted to my ancestors. We all brought, you know, we became Muslims at the hands of the Sufis. So it has been a very vibrant culture. I believe Islam is like a clear water spring that takes on the colors of the land that it flows through. It's not some old Arab unchanging religion. And to tell you about how best, I mean, Saeed Bhai really reflects in his book, I loved his book, Being the Other, and it really, he tells us how syncretic, how much the Sufis have contributed. I mean, I was discussing with somebody who was doing a session on yoga, that it's very strange how yoga became a central Sufi practice in India. And today, again, you have this silly discourse where a lot of Maulvis say this is un-Islamic. It was never considered. There was so much of exchange between the yogis and the Sufis, which actually led to this wonderful bhakti movement, which went beyond the politics of identity, which is really so much of the problem. I would like to, because we are in Jaipur, 2 hours away from Ajmer, I mean, like you said, there's one Islam. My Kaaba is Ajmer. It is the Mecca of my heart. And I think nothing in the subcontinent really is the symbol of Islamic spirituality as Ajmer Sharif. And Khaja Gharib Nawaz said, you know, what were these Sufis doing? They were really preaching Islam as it should be preached. He said, develop sun-like bounty, river-like generosity, and earth-like hospitality. He was not rejecting. I do not think Islam requires you to commit cultural apostasies. And that is what is happening today. If you ask me to identify when we were talking the extremist elements, I think that is the Islam that is being hijacked. And there are of course, very many reasons for it. Some of it are external and some of it are internal. And if you really want me to identify it in a very broad sense, it is the petrodollars that I think has been the biggest curse in the Muslim communities globally, because that is what is destroying cultures, ripping out local conditions. And what they're really doing is rejecting 1400 years of scholarship, philosophy, culture, to local traditions. I mean, in Africa, Islam is African. They do their zikr with drums. In Persia, it is, you know, it is Persian. In China, you have a Chinese Islam. And in India, so therefore you have an Indian Islam. And it's absolutely not in conflict with the nature of Islam, because I think Islam celebrates diversity. The Quran says itself, that's where my work is, because I'm trying to connect the classical tradition as Sufism, as we call it, back to the central core teachings of Islam. I mean, the Prophet did say that, you know, we're all from Adam's family. And the Quran also clearly tells us that we made you into nations and tribes so that you may know each other. I mean, divinity is a divine idea. It cannot be challenged. And that is because it would be, if we really believe that only God has agency, you know, then this is the way he planned it, and we have to celebrate that diversity, and it is, you know, part of nature. And like Saeed Bhai said, I mean, you know, it's about where he was talking about this hate. I really feel hate is so much energy. Hate is unsustainable. And that is why we have to reclaim spirituality for the soul. It is the jurisprudence of the soul, I would say, you know, which bring healing, which bring love, which bring humanity. And we have to really focus less and less on law, because the law is, you know, we are not to serve the law. The law has to save us. And I think some of the problems that are coming in with Muslim communities is that, you know, we've rejected our spiritual traditions and we are focusing too much on law, and that too without compassion and rahm, which is really God's foremost attribute.
So what comes out of you know, of what all of you said is that we're established the fact that, you know, the kind of Islam that drives radicalization, or that the expressions of Islam we're seeing today, this is not real Islam in your words, or as Sadia basically dedicated a book to show how it was captured, or you said now it was like hijacked, and we're kind of, perhaps we do not understand very well, and it's not clear well how it came about, or, you know, there are lots of question marks, but how do we go out of that, and how do we move for a better future? And in that sense, the last thing you said, Sadia, I want to bring it to Saeed. We do live in a let's come back to India. We live in democratic secular state, and where the framework of law is, of course, you know, the framework for our, you know, for the state. And you say at the end, towards the end of your book, and I want to quote you saying, if the country, and Saeed speaks of India, if the country were to keep up the pretense of secularism and equality, it needed the other, although those of us who belong to these categories seem to be in short supply. So I want to ask you how, in the light of all this, all you have written, how is it that Muslims in India still have a stake in the nation? And what are the implications for India's democracy and for future?
It's a very difficult question to answer. In fact, it is a question that cannot be answered for a simple reason, that there is no such thing as a Muslim monolith in India, indeed as there isn't anywhere else. So the Mapela Muslim in Kerala will have to work out his salvation within the Malayali framework. The Labbai Muslim of Tamil Nadu and of Kelakarai will have to work his salvation in that framework. You know, there's a lot of confusion in India. Let me give you an example. For instance, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore is an extremely secular poet and a writer and a thinker. He wrote the song which Nehru and others adopted as the national anthem of India. He also wrote the national anthem of Bangladesh, did Gurudev. Totally secular, but a poet whose verse sears with Tandav, Shiva, Shakti, Kali, Durga, not a verse without them. We have arbitrarily confined him as the national poet of Bangladesh. Now, I'm talking about Qazi Nazrul Islam. Qazi Nazrul Islam, here is a poet. This is the syncretism of the subcontinent, and that is the syncretism of the Bengali part of India. Similarly, if you go to Kerala, you have Kalamandalam Haidar Ali, who is the greatest Kathakali performer in Kerala. You go to Tamil Nadu, the original scholar on Kambar Ramayanam was Justice Ismail. The greatest player of Nadeshwaram was Chinna Maulana Sahib. And you carry on. India is full of pockets of syncretism. What I have started with is my experience of syncretism in the Awadh area, which was very floral, full of filigree, full of beauty, full of folksiness. You see, you cannot have urbanity, and urban centers are melting pots. But where things well from one into the other, you need a continuum between the city and the folksy and the rural countryside, of which Awadh was replete and filled. Do you know something? To this day, there has never been a communal riot within the confines of the area we call Awadh. We keep talking about riots, but not once in the confines of Awadh area. There's something about that soil. A point that we sometimes, if I'm overtaking my time, sometimes we forget. One interesting date, let me ask you to remember. 711. 711 is the date when Muhammad bin Qasim makes his first probe into India. 711 is also the date when Tariq ibn Ziyad gallops across North Africa, crosses that area from Morocco into Spain, and he calls it Jabal al-Tariq, the rock of Tariq, which the British call Gibraltar. That was the beginning of 700 years of. Since then, the history of the three Semitic religions has been a history of conflicts, has been a history of continuous conflicts. The Inquisition was supposed to be about the Muslims, but actually it was the Jews who were the basic targets of the Spanish Inquisition. Now here in India, you have exactly in fact, the Cheruman Perumal Mosque in Kerala, Cranganore, is built at the time when the Prophet is alive, because the linkages between the Kerala coast and the Arabian coast predate Islam, you see. Here, there is no known area of conflict. Conflict comes on a scale, on a political scale, after 1857.
I just need to add to Saeed Bhai's. And just tell him, I know you have Ovid chauvinism, and I know you love Ovid, but what you're saying of the syncretic culture is not confined to Ovid. Yes, we have great examples of it.
I gave you 10 examples.
No.
I was talking about mine.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. I'm just
examples.
joking. But what I'm saying, I'm just taking your point further, that even in Kashmir, you had the Rishi Sufis who remained celibate, who didn't eat meat. So again, you know, the Islam that came to Kashmir was very organic. Delhi, you had the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. Basant as a festival is still celebrated in the Chishti Dargahs, in the Dargah of Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, and you have the Qawwali and the poetry. Amir Khusro is claimed both by the Hindi and Urdu walas as their first poet. You have the creation of the tabla and the sitar in the south, in the Deccan. You have, so wherever you have these, Baba Farid, we go back to the, just a minute, we go back to the 13th century. There are 134 shlokas of Baba Farid in the Guru Granth Sahib. And Mian Mir laid the foundation of the Golden Temple. So we have, what I'm trying to say is that just going a bit further to really elaborate what Saeed and the points that he makes in his book. And I think these are things that we are forgetting about, that we are very rooted in that kind of syncretism, and we need to preserve that.
And this is very important. This is a very important thing that you both bring in your book, which is to bring up to the public this history, this way of life, these daily practices. And yet at the same time, my question comes from the fact that your book ultimately is also a statement of the negligence of Muslim citizenship in India and how that has been, their othering that has been taken place, especially from the 1980s onwards. And that's, so my question, so the question of, so how can they still have a stake in the nation? It is an important question to understand, precisely because the kind of Islam we see in India is not the kind of thing we see in Daesh or the same radicalization there, and whether indeed the answer is in you spoke about the local context, but can you say something about that?
A social, cultural amalgamation, syncretism, was disrupted by politics. Remember that. It was social, cultural, completely most elegant, most lyrical, coming together. And if there was time, I could cite from A to Z, coming together, disrupted by politics. And politics, which at one stage leaves me in a kind of despair, where the last couplet I write there is, "Turfa tar ye hai ke apna bhi na jana aur yun hi." The irony is that you didn't consider me your own. And just like that, turfa tar ye hai ke apna bhi na jana aur yun hi apna apna keh ke हमको सबसे बेगाना किया. अपना अपना कह के हमको सबसे बेगाना किया. But don't forget that a couplet represents sometimes a universal truth and sometimes a mood. So this is a mood. This encapsulates a mood in which the last chapter is written. It is a political. How we are going to repair it will have to be a political thing. You give me 2 minutes, I'll explain it to you in as succinct a manner as I can. In 1947, we trapped ourselves into a triangle. In 1947, we trapped ourselves into a triangle. What is that triangle? New Delhi, Srinagar, India, Pakistan, Hindu, Muslim are one complex of issues politically. New Delhi, Srinagar, India, Pakistan, Hindu, Muslim are one complex of issues. Anyone who says he's charging off to Srinagar to solve the Kashmir issue is lying to himself, he's lying to you, he's lying to the Kashmiris, and he's lying to Indians and Pakistanis, everybody. Unless you bring Pakistan in, that issue cannot be solved. The minute you bring Pakistan in, Hindu-Muslim temperature comes down. The minute Hindu-Muslim temperature comes down, and you, Ornit, should know better than other, the project of Hindu consolidation in the context of Mandal is hit for a 6. So we are in that trap. That is the trap.
Okay, so
unless we think our way through it, we will not be able to get out of it.
So moving from the Indian trap, I just want to, I think it's very important that we'll address one more aspect of othering that is happening, and that comes out in your book, Tabish. And you touches upon the ways Muslims in the West make the West their other. So it's not just the othering of the Muslim, it's not simply a one-way process of othering of the Muslim, there's an equal tendency to brush the West, right? So in your book, to make it more tangible to you here, so in the book, for example, Jamina, upon reflection, she says, like, how had I failed to register the many people who did accept me? Or she says in another context, she says, we did not distinguish between Jews and Israelis and Zionists. We had never met any. For us, the terms were interchangeable. So tell us more about this other process of othering.
In the novel, you'll come across different kinds of othering, how Muslims are othered, but also how Muslims other other people. A good example is, of course, the dominant tendency in Muslim society is not to be able to distinguish between Zionism, Israel, Israeli government, and Jews. Okay, that's just one example of othering. I could give you lots of examples, but I think it would be better if you read them in the novel because they come across better. What I would like to add there is that part of the problem has to do with a certain degree of lack of self-reflection in all communities, including among Muslims. And some of it has to do with the way in which religions are being interpreted everywhere, not just religions, even secular religions like neoliberalism, which basically tells you this is the only way, this is the only option, you can only do this, okay? And the way to understand it is to think of how human beings think. We assume that human beings think through numbers, theories, and so on and so forth. That all comes later. The most original, most creative way for human beings to think is through stories. And all religions have known that, which is why they give you stories. What fundamentalism does, whether it's Islamic, Christian, or neoliberal, it says this story has only this meaning. And that's it. Then you're stuck. That's also one of the root causes of the problem.
Okay, thanks. Just really please, quickly as you can, Qaisra, because I do want to leave time for the audience. I wanted to ask you what is the hope for feminism in the face of entrenched patriarchy, but from the British perspective of being also a Muslim in Britain, please.
I've heard a lot about the Indian situation. I wanted to share with the audience here what is it like for us as Muslims in terms of othering. But really, it's been a nightmare for us for the last many, many years, since September the 11th. And people like us living in Britain, in the West, are sort of sandwiched between two monsters. ISIS on one side, Islamophobia on the other side, anti-Muslim hatred on the other. And I feel as a writer, I'm using my platform to reach out to people, to talk to them, to challenge their stereotypes. And in particular, when I go around to German schools, I say, I'm a Muslim, I love my faith, but I'm not an extremist. Please connect with people like us. Islam has been hijacked. It really has been. It's been demonized. And in particular, I resent the term extremism is always attached to Muslim. And I say, why is that? You have extremists in every faith. You have them in India, Hindu extremists who also kill. You have Buddhist extremists who kill. You have Ku Klux Klan, Christians who kill. So why is it the tag of Muslim extremists being used. And I have to remind my audience there, I said, look, 2 billion people, and there's a minority of extremists. Are you going to judge 2 billion people for a minority of people? And in particular, the moment I feel very passionately about is how the women are being victimized, absolutely victimized. You must have seen the fiasco about the burkini thing in France, women being forced at gunpoint to remove their veil. What nonsense is this? What sort of world have we entered? France is a democracy. Britain is a democracy. But when it comes to Muslim women, they're forever being stereotyped. They're ever being targeted. And you know what? I've interviewed over 100 women across 5 nations and 32 hours of recording. Every single woman was unique. Every single woman was different. And I believe it's an equality issue. Who has the right to tell me how to dress, whether to take off my niqab, take off my burqa, or to put it on? It is wrong, it's wrong, and I've had enough of being victimized as a woman.
Thanks. So as final question, and it's big, but you'll be quick because we do want the audience to have the option. So, you know, I want to quote to you something, and it really brings together the kind of big questions you were left with. In Tabish's novel, Jamila says at a certain point, you cannot really discuss a moderate faith with someone who has an immoderate version of it. Any such discussion gets taken over by the person who holds the religious high ground, and you will either have to relinquish all claims to faith, which leaves you nowhere in such a debate, or you have to scramble for higher theological grounds, which makes your rational objections disappear or seem unsound. So in this light, Sadia, is it then productive, or how productive is it to actually seek solutions in Islam or in the realm of religion, or finding the real Islam?
Well, if we are to save the world, we have to look at solutions. I don't know if I have them, but I'm very happy to hear, and I think we all kind of agree, Qaisra, Tabish, Saeed, we are more or less saying the same thing, and particularly what you just said and what you just said. The problem is twofold. It is from, as for the Muslims, it's from the outside and it's from the inside. So it does need that solution. And quickly, I'll tell you what I do think, that the world has to also look at lived Islam and move away from headline Islam, and look and engage with poetry, with architecture, with spirituality. I mean, look at Rumi. In Rumi, a lot of the translations are actually, you find the Islamic discourse taken away from Rumi. Rumi is the Quran, they say in Persian. So you have to engage with Maulana Muhammad Jalaluddin Rumi. You cannot just be Rumi. So I think Sufism is a very welcoming door because it's very participatory by nature. It has beautiful traditions of music, of spirituality, of writing, of poetry. So I think it's a very good door to engage with Islam, and quickly. And for the Muslims, I think we have to stop. We really have to, like Tabish said, require a lot of self-reflection, get out of a conspiracy and a victimization mindset, and really look at how we can engage with our spirituality, with philosophy, with law, and so that we make space and form moderation, and also be creative in engaging with issues of modernity, make space for, be creative with our laws, especially when it comes to gender issues. And I'll quickly just end on the last thing where you say moderation. I really think I want to end on my little thing on what the Prophet said. He said moderation, moderation, moderation. Only with moderation will you succeed. And he also said, very well-known hadith, beware of extremism, because it was extremism that destroyed communities before you. So we have to reclaim the moderate ground that is shrinking.
Thanks.
In answer to one of the observations, there are basically two kinds of religions. Religions that insist on universality, say all human beings are the same, and the good thing there is that, of course, they are all the same, but if they don't seem to accept that message, there can be a lot of fanaticism against them. Okay? Then there are also religions that seem to insist, and these are usually older religions, on differences, you belong to a particular caste or not, and so on and so forth. And the advantage there is that you don't set out to convert people, but then there can always be a lot of differences within the formation.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.